All right, everyone. Today's going to be a special episode. This is going to be a Thanksgiving episode, and we're going to talk about Thanksgiving specifically. I think Thanksgiving is probably the most underrated holiday in America, and I'm going to kind of run through the history of where Thanksgiving came from, the history of it, the historical context of it, and give you a little bit of an idea as to how it's probably the most important holiday that we still celebrate today. And oddly enough, it kind of feels like it's still sacred. Um, it's the only holiday that was pretty much granted to us by God. And it seems like that's why it might not have been co-opted over the course of the last several hundred years that, Americans have been celebrating it. It's been celebrated since before America was even officially a country. So it's technically the oldest holiday that we still celebrate today in America that has to do with the roots of America specifically. Yes, we do celebrate Christmas. Back during biblical times, people did not celebrate Christmas, but it has become a popular holiday that is, and has been celebrated for a very long time. But in terms of holidays that we celebrate specifically for, um, and in America that have American roots, Thanksgiving is the oldest holiday that we still celebrate, and in the tradition that it was originally celebrated by. I'm going to run through the history of how we got to Thanksgiving, and it starts with Christopher Columbus. So they don't really teach this in the history books, but America has always had Christian roots. Uh, from its very moment of discovery by Christopher Columbus up until today in this nation, we see a resurgence of God and Christ, coming back. There's a lot of people that are being born again. If you look across, the nation, just look at the news, just look at different states, especially, states that you would least expect, like California. Uh, I think in 2024 alone, the amount of mass baptisms that have taken place in this country, I think it broke all historical records. Even the numbers of people who have been baptized in one day has broken historical records in this country. California, I think, is the leading state to have performed the most amount of baptisms in one day in American history. So there is definitely a resurgence and a revival of, Christianity in America right now today. And we saw a lot of that over the last couple of years. In fact, the last 4 years specifically, we saw the Asbury Church revival. I think that was in Kentucky, which was basically people gathered and prayed and, worshiped at that church for a consecutive number of days. I don't even know how many days it was, but it was a very, very long time for 24 hours a day straight around the clock. They had a live stream and everything. And all different types of people worship and accepted Jesus as their Lord and Savior right there. We've had, so many people in this country convert to Christianity over the last few years. And we've seen a lot of, it's opinionated, but a lot of miracles happen in this country. One of the biggest ones was Roe v. Wade being overturned, which was huge for the Christian community specifically, because if not all, most Christians are and or should be pro-life. That was a historical and monumental moment in this country because it put the power of abortions back in the hands of the states. So now it will probably prevent a lot of abortions from happening and help women who are in those positions find better alternatives, rather than performing an abortion. And that's just a few of the many things that have happened over the last few years in this country in regards to the revival of Christianity and God in this nation. But I want to go back in time to tell you the story of how all this came about and how we got to Thanksgiving and, kind of hopefully show you some documents that are really quite interesting that go with this story. So we all know from school that Christopher Columbus discovered America in 1492. He sailed with his three ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. He sailed to America from Spain, and he technically he was an Italian man, but he was sailing for the Spanish government, and he sailed to America and discovered the land, the new land. which would eventually become America. But they leave out in the schools, at least today, I don't think they teach this. I mean, I'm 99% sure they don't teach it because I didn't learn this growing up in school. And, I don't really know anybody who has. We have to kind of dig for this information, but it should be in the school system, especially if they're teaching these things. I know there's a lot of issues today with Christopher Columbus, and a lot of people, movements that are against certain things have tarnished his reputation and have said, things about him, some of which are probably true, but some of which likely aren't. But the number one thing, the number one key takeaway that they're not teaching in the schools that's actually true and can be proven with documentation from Christopher Columbus's words himself. Christopher Columbus believed that he was called by God to go and discover the new land. He was setting out on a journey to discover the Indies. And the goal was, I believe, to set up a trade route. But regardless, he felt called by God to take this voyage and go and discover the new land. And at that time, it seemed impossible. In fact, a lot of people thought that, this is kind of making a resurgence too, but a lot of people thought that the world was flat and that if he sailed too far across the ocean, he would fall off the face of the earth. There's a lot of people that believe the earth is flat again today. Um, it's kind of funny how history does, if not repeat itself, it does rhyme or whatever the sayings are. But things tend to ideas tend to resurface, even though they've been thoroughly worked out at one point in time. They resurface again in the present day, and we, are a new generation of people live through that same concept. So that is quite funny. But he believed he was called by God to take this voyage. So he went to many different, monarchs, kings and queens and different people of different countries to see who would fund his expedition, because it was going to be extremely costly. At that time, it was going to be a lot of money that would have probably equaled into the millions. And, people didn't have money the way they have it today. The governments today just print money and they could just give you that dollar amount. But back then, their money was actually backed by real things like gold and silver and stuff like that. So he had to go to people who had the most wealth, either business people or the government themselves, to fund his voyage. So he went to many different governments, and they all rejected him and laughed at him and said that his idea was crazy. Finally, he went to the Spanish king and queen, Isabella and Ferdinand of Spain. He felt called by God, and he felt that those two people were the ones that were supposed to fund his voyage, that they were the ones that God had wanted him to join forces with to fund his journey. And at the time, they actually really liked his idea. They thought that it was possible that there could be undiscovered land out there, and they were a growing superpower. So they really wanted to, try and amass as much land and wealth and natural resources as possible so that they could continue to grow their nation and their power and authority over the world. But at the time, the Spanish government was at war with another country called the Moors. The people were called the Moors. And they were at war with them. And the war was very, heated. There was a lot of money being poured into it. So the government didn't really have any extra money to give to Columbus for this voyage. So they basically told him, come back after the war is over and we will talk about this. And he was torn up because he really believed he was called by God to do this and that they were his path to get there. But for some reason, he couldn't get there. So he prayed a lot. He consulted with different people in the church. And finally, one of the high priests, I think his name is Father Perez, he was close with the Queen Isabella, and he had pleaded with her to reconsider Columbus's idea and to fund his operation, because he too felt that Columbus was called by God. So now you also had people from the church that believed that this man specifically was called by God to make this voyage. And what was special about Columbus is that he used to design maps. So he kind of had this experience in life from designing maps and became like a master navigator. And that was like really needed because not only did he have to figure out how to get to a location that no one had ever been to, he had to also create a visual representation of what that looked like to send to the people back home so that they would now have a visual of what was this new land, what did it look like. He had to basically map it out for them. Um, so eventually the queen agreed. She said, I'll meet with him again. We'll have another meeting to discuss this. And what was ironic was this very same day, I believe it was the same day, I could be wrong, but the very same day that the queen decided to meet with Columbus and reconsider his offer and his idea, the Moors, they surrendered. They gave up and admitted that Spain won the war, and the war ended that day. So it was almost like God, the queen was saying to Columbus, come back when the war is over. And God was basically saying, he'll end the war when you fund Columbus's operation, when you basically accept his offer. So it ended up working out where the war ended. The king and queen of Spain were so happy that they felt they needed to thank God for this victory. So they did, in fact, fund Columbus's voyage. And what was funny was that there's a lot of things with dates in America. In biblical history too, there's a lot of stuff with dates have historical significance. Well, especially it plays true to America. So he set sail, I believe, in October of 1492. It was a treacherous journey. He, went with a crew of people. They went to discover this new land, and it was a really harrowing journey. He had to overcome a lot of stuff, dangers on the sea, being on the ocean for so long, so many days in a row. And back then, they didn't have really anything. They didn't have, navigational tools like we have today. They didn't have the ships built the way that we have them built. They had to go across the open ocean, which was extremely dangerous. And they didn't really know where they were going. They had to kind of wing it. They were just going off of Columbus's, basically his faith in believing that the Holy Spirit was leading him in the right direction, and also his navigational skills from, creating maps for so many years. So finally, as we know the story goes, he arrived in America, he discovered the land, and it was a miracle. But he, many believed at that time and still today that he was called by God. And another little interesting fact, his name Christopher, the term, I believe it goes back to mean Christ bearer. So he was basically bringing with him not only, the hope of discovering this new land, but his promise to spread Christ's message across to the new land. And if you read your Bible, I believe it says that Jesus will not return until, Christ's message is spread to all four corners of the earth. So it was likely God's intention to have him discover this land because he was a Christian, and he would spread the gospel in this new land where they had not heard that before. And that was in fact true. When he got there, there were Indians there. Everybody knows there were, Native Americans that lived on that land at that time. Now they called them Indians, but they weren't from India. They called them Indians because he was traveling to try and discover the Indies. So they named the native people there Indians. It has nothing to do with the country of India, but he found these people and he realized that they were practicing a lot of pagan things, pagan rituals, and all different types of heathenistic behavior that they were enjoying because they had never heard the gospel. So Columbus and people that were with him, missionaries, over the course of several trips back and forth to America, they had spread the gospel to the Indians. And the Indians, not all of them, but some tribes were very open to these new people. They were interested and intrigued because they had never seen anybody like them. They hadn't seen anybody that looked like them. A lot of them had not really even seen white people before. And they didn't see the type of clothes that they've worn, the guns. They were not used to that evolved technology of weaponry. They were used to bows and arrows and stuff like that. Even their ships, they were not used to these gigantic ships. They had canoes and boats and stuff like that, but they were not used to these people. So they were very curious and very intrigued by them. And some of them were open because they were a little bit more friendly tribes. They were open to learning about their cultures and their religion. So much so that many Indians, and this is another thing that they don't teach in schools, but this is a very important integral part of our nation's history because there's so much talk about how the white man came to America and we took the land from the Indians and they, basically killed them all and destroyed everything that they, loved and cared about. That's not entirely true. When Columbus and the early missionaries came and in several trips to America, they had spread the gospel to the Indians. The Indians, some of them, like I said, some tribes were open to it, accepted Christ. They actually got converted and became Christians. In fact, some of them even got baptized in America in the waters. And that was monumental because these people had never heard of this religion or this God before. But some of them saw that things were not working in their favor in their lives, in their own personal lives. So they were open to securing something new. And some of them felt so compelled and moved by the story of Jesus that they actually gave their lives to Christ and got baptized. So there was a lot of Christian roots in the founding of this country, even so much so that the natives that lived in this country before accepted the Christian religion. So Christianity is the foundation of this nation. It always has been from day one, from the time that it was founded up until today. But like many different things in life, time and, people uh, affect things in a positive and negative way. There were many different types of people who had come to America over the course of over 100 years from the time that Columbus came. There were people who came from, Spain and other countries. Great Britain was a huge country and one of the world's superpowers at that time. They wanted to expand their power as well, so they sent people. And not everybody who came to America was a Christian and had the intentions of going there to discover the new land and spreading the gospel. So some of the people who came were just regular people. They were, people who worked on the ships. They were people who were trying to set up trade routes with the new lands, the Indies, and they were just, regular people who weren't Christians. So when they came to America, they didn't act appropriately. They treated the Indians like not well. Some of the Indian tribes were hostile anyway, just because that was their culture. So there ended up being, over the course of 100 years, a lot of fighting with the Indians and the people from the eastern part of the world, mainly Europe, but Spain as well. So for about 100 years, there was a lot of hostility that built up between the Indians and these other people. So now years later, in the early 1600s, in Europe, Great Britain specifically, there was a lot of religious persecution that was going on. A lot of the Christians in that nation were being pushed out of their country, either by the monarch was telling them they had to leave if they wouldn't worship and obey the government, or they were just being persecuted because of what they believed and how they believed their religion. The government at the time believed that they were the ultimate authority and they would be able to dictate to the people how they can worship, how they can go into their church. And the churches got really corrupted, much like they are today in America. They just became so big and inflated, and they became sort of, corporatized in a way, but under the control of the government, under the monarchy. So they were telling the Christians how they were allowed to worship. And then there was a group of people who decided they didn't want to be told that. And they didn't believe that the monarchy was the head of the church. They believed that Christ was, because that's what he said. So they were true Christians. They decided they just couldn't live in this country anymore. So they decided to separate themselves from the modern church of that time. And they ended up sort of being like exiled in their own countries, where they had to do all these crazy things. That's where we actually got the term separatist from. They separated themselves from the church and from the government, from the state, in order to have religious freedom. Okay. So they started basically worshiping in private and holding church services in each other's homes. And they had to do all these crazy things to be able to, just worship God the way they wanted to. They had to take different, routes to get to someone's house to worship in private, away from the prying eyes of the church and of the government. And it became difficult for them because they were basically being like stalked and, treated like enemies just because they wanted religious freedom. So it got so bad, and it got to a boiling point that they finally decided they had to leave their country. They couldn't live there anymore, and they had to go seek a land that was going to accept them and their right to practice religion freely. They wanted to truly live biblically. They wanted to live completely free and have the right to, basically live the way they wanted to as a child of God. And at that time, Great Britain was such a big nation. It was so corrupted. There was so much, heathenistic behavior that was going on, a lot of worldly stuff. And they just wanted to disassociate from it all and go back to living a small, simple life. It's ironic because that's kind of where America is today. America is this big nation that's become so mainstream and corporatized that there are people now that are just packing it all in and buying some land and homesteading and farming and trying to live a small, simple life. And it's funny how, again, like history kind of repeats itself. So these people decided that's it. We have to leave. We have to find new land. So they fled to other countries for religious freedom. But finally, it got to a point where they needed to set out to find a permanent home to start fresh. Now, at this point, people had basically knew the Americas existed, and it had been discovered over 100 years ago. So many people had already made the journey there, for different reasons. So they preyed on it just like Columbus did, and they seek counsel, and they finally came to the conclusion that they too had to set out to go to America and start their life there. They felt called by God that that was where He wanted them to be. So they, packed it all in and decided to make the journey. And in 1620, so over 120 years later, after Columbus, they had set out to make that journey. The same issue that Columbus had, they had. They needed to make the journey, but it was an expensive trip. And it was probably less expensive at that time versus when Columbus basically pioneered it. Um, but they needed a lot of money to make the trip, and they couldn't really afford to. And not just that, they needed to be able to set up there. They needed to be able to get everything set up. They had no foundation. They were going to undeveloped land, and they needed to basically build everything from scratch. So they needed enough money, food, supplies, all that stuff to get themselves started. So they had to also seek financial backers. So they ended up working out a deal with these financial backers that they would fund their trip, their voyage, but the goal was to have them set up an operation there and set up a trade route so that the investors would have ownership of that trade route and now have a whole new, um, you know, revenue stream, basically establishing like farming and manufacturing in this new land to trade with their home country of Great Britain or wherever they were from at that time. So the separatists agreed. But what they didn't realize is that they had intended them to be debt slaves. They wanted them to basically be under their rule, and that's not what they wanted. They wanted to be pilgrims. They wanted to flee that country where they grew up and everything they knew, leave it all behind, and go start fresh in a brand new land and build this whole new community based around living a truly biblical life under God. Regardless, they made a deal with these investors. It was the only way to get there. So they, went on their journey and they were going to stick to that agreement. They had an agreement to go to a specific location that was in those investors' jurisdiction. They ended up getting caught in some bad weather, and then I think it drifted the ship further north, and they ended up not landing where they had originally planned and where they had agreed upon to be in the jurisdiction of these investors. So since they were no longer in the investors' jurisdiction, they decided to break the deal that they had with them, and that they were free people. They were under no one's jurisdiction. They were in undiscovered land that no one had really been to, and they were going to start a whole new civilization. So they actually made a document called the Mayflower Compact. They had sailed on the Mayflower. We all know that from school. And they had made this compact where they were basically saying how we are going to be self-governed people. And that is the roots of our founding, that our founding fathers had basically carried on that concept when they created our founding documents, especially the Constitution, where, between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, they declared that we have inalienable rights from God, and that we were going to be self-governed. We were going to run our own, show, and no one was going to tell us what to do. The power would be instilled in the people. That's where we, the people, comes from. Well, a lot of people don't know that all goes back to the Mayflower Compact. That pretty much goes back to that moment where those pilgrims decided we're going to detach ourselves from any world government and we're going to be the first self-governed nation in the world. Now, they didn't, I don't think, know or believe that they were going to one day build an actual country out of it, but they thought they could at least have one little colony and a community where they lived in villages and they just basically took care of themselves. They provided for themselves and they built everything on their own. and they didn't have a overlord ruling over them. So this was the document that they created. And you can actually find this online if you just search the Mayflower Compact. It was basically, like it says, an agreement between the settlers of the New Plymouth colony, or the community, in 1620. That's the year that they set out, and they basically decided that they were going to be self-governed. They literally put it in this compact. The goal was the advancement of the Christian faith and to honor our king and country. And they had an intention of starting the first colony. So it's all right there. This was Cape Cod. They landed in Cape Cod in November. Now, see, that's another month that has significance. So Columbus landed in October, and they landed in November. And another important thing to take note of is their king at the time was King James. Now, King James was the king, as it's written here, of England, France, and Ireland. And if you notice, there's a King James version of the Bible. That's where that comes from. And so that's a Bible version that we still use today. It's considered amongst the biblical communities to be one of the most accurate translations into English language, and I think one of the earliest ones. Um, it's a great version. I actually read that version predominantly over other versions, because it's got a lot of the old world language that I like to read in there. But these people, they were really truly Christians, and even their king had basically, constructed his own version of the Bible, for people to read the English translation. So these people there's so much biblical anomalies that were sort of, put into place in order for these pilgrims to get to where they were. It's as though God lined up all the stars for them to, make it to America and start this, new colony. And down here is just a lot of the people who, put their names on the compact. This was who the agreement was between. These were the actual people who were the pilgrims. So you can actually find that document online if you ever want to just read it yourself. It's really interesting. It's a really interesting part of our history. And it might be good to read, especially on Thanksgiving, to be able to read part of history that was an integral part of what would eventually become the first holiday that we celebrate in this country. So we know that the pilgrims landed in Cape Cod in 1620 in November. And the story goes on, for the first year that they were in America, starting their colony, they ran into a lot of problems. Now, that whole time they had God by them. That whole time they had God guiding them and, helping them through these difficulties, because, we're not supposed to have an easy life. It even says, don't pray for an easy life in the Bible, pray for the strength to endure a difficult one. So anytime they ran into issues, they would pray. And they had a lot of issues along the way because they were just getting started. It was a brand new thing to them. They had to think about that. They left a nation that was like the number one superpower in the world at the time. And it had everything that anybody in the world at that time could have ever wanted was available in this nation. And they left all that. They left all the modern, things that they had known their whole existence behind to come to a brand new land that was completely undeveloped. It had nothing. I mean, think about that. They had no homes, no places to sleep. There was no shelter. There was no food. They had to literally hunt for or grow their own food from scratch. There was nothing. Uh, you know, Modern people today would not be able to handle any of that, let alone their iPhone running out of a battery, while they're in the middle of using it or something. Could you imagine? There's no plumbing, there's no bathrooms, there's no food, there's no anything. You literally have to make it all on your own. If you don't have clothes with you, you have nothing to keep warm if the temperature drops. And this was November. Now, we all know in the north, in Cape Cod, which is off the coast of Massachusetts, at that time, especially, near the ocean in November, the temperatures get really cold. Imagine having nothing, no heat, no shelter, nothing. Just surviving that would be a miracle. And this is what these people did. They built it all from scratch. But that first year was very difficult for them. They didn't have anything. They had to learn it all and figure it all out, trial and error along the way. They also had a lot of issues with Indians because at that time, the Indians for the past 100 years had learned a lot about the Europeans, and they had, encountered so many problems with them along the way. They've warred with each other. Many killed each other. The Indians killed, the white men from Europe, and the white men killed the Indians. There was a lot of battles that happened during that time. There was a lot of, evil and crazy things that went on. And so the Indians at that time had already decided how they felt about the Europeans. So the Pilgrims, who were not violent people, they were just trying to build their new life, had encountered a lot of problems with the Indians, who looked at them as a threat and attacked them as well. But there finally came one turning point, um, for them, and that was in 1621, where one Indian, who would later be called Squanto, and I think, maybe some people remember him because, he's been written about in books. I think they even made movies about, this historical figure, and he might have been taught in schools, when you were younger, in, maybe grammar school or something. Um, but he was a real person. He actually existed, and he was an Indian that actually had good encounters with Europeans, and he had both good and bad, but he had good encounters with Europeans, so he actually was comfortable around them, and could recognize the threats from the people that were just trying to build a colony. So he stumbled into the colony one day, um, and he had basically introduced himself and explained that he was from that land, and that his family was no longer there, and that he had basically just been traveling a lot, and he ended up taking a liking to the Pilgrims, and they liked him. And so much so that he ended up, staying long periods of time. He would teach them things, and they built a relationship. He actually wanted to help them become self-sufficient. So he taught them a lot of stuff. He taught them how to properly, farm and grow their crops because they were having trouble with their yields. He taught them, certain things about hunting and things about the land, the geography, because they were new to the area. So he spent time really building a relationship with them and helping them get this colony off the ground. So by the following year in 1621, they were flourishing. They were doing a lot better. And they had, built good relationships with the local Indians, so much so that they even set up trade routes through Squanto, dealing with the other Indians. They had set up trade routes, and now they were basically trading and having like a business relationship with the Indians. So they were not only getting along, they were establishing an economy in America. These were just people who left their homeland, and they built everything from scratch, even an economy with the locals who had lived there. So later that year, they were doing so well, and the colony was finally flourishing, that they were grateful to God, because it was a rough start in the beginning, that they decided to, the governor of the colony decided to declare a day of Thanksgiving. So this is where Thanksgiving comes from. We've learned a little bit about this in, our, schooling and in history classes and stuff, where the Pilgrims and the Indians decided to, no longer go to war with each other and have a day like, where they, at least this is my recollection of it from school, where they would have like one day where they got together and got along, and then, they would just go to their normal lives. That's not the case. They built a relationship with the Indians long before that, for that whole year before. Um, and then they eventually got to the point where they were so grateful to God and to the Indians for helping them get started. And the Indians were happy that these, Europeans weren't trying to kill them or take their land. So they ended up creating a great relationship, that they decided to have this day of Thanksgiving. And it was a day where they were thanking God. That's another huge thing that they leave out of all this stuff. The day of Thanksgiving was surrounded around thanking God for blessing them and their colony, and bringing these Indian people into their life to really help them, because before that, it was likely they would have died if they couldn't get their crops to grow. They would not have sustained long term. So the Indians played a huge role in that. And they basically, loved this relationship. They wanted peace, and they wanted to continue their relationship. So the governor and the people invited the Indians to come join them for this day of Thanksgiving, where they would feast together and, basically just, enjoy the reward and reap what they sowed, which was all the crops that were harvesting. Now they would, finally take those and cook them and eat in thanks to these Indians for helping them grow those crops in the first place. So again, another historical month, right? October. They made the day of Thanksgiving in October. Columbus landed in America in October. And we celebrate Thanksgiving today in November, but it was originally celebrated in October. A lot of that had to do with the harvest of the foods at the time were ready at that time in October, and everything was fresher back then because it really couldn't be stored and saved the way it is today. Um, the Indians agreed, so they came and met with the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims at the time were worried because I think like 100 Indians showed up, and they weren't sure if they would have enough food for them and all the pilgrims and for their harvest to last them a little bit through the winter. But the Indians ended up showing up bearing food. They didn't come empty handed. So that's where, you know, Thanksgiving really became um, meal centered around the meal and sharing the meal together, and everybody sort of bringing like a portion to contribute to the meal. But this is where the turkeys come from. The Indians, they hunted, so they brought deer and they brought other animals and they brought turkeys, and that is something that we still celebrate today. It's the staple of the Thanksgiving dinners, the turkey. Well, that originated from the Indians bringing the turkeys to dinner with the Pilgrims for the first Thanksgiving ever. And they had a lot of other food. They had all the vegetables from their crops. But even at this time, like back then, they didn't really have the appliances the way that we have them today. But they were able to bake pies. They had fruit from earlier harvests, and they baked pies, and they baked all kinds of things, all kinds of different food. They had huge meal, and you know, personally, I don't even really know how they stored all this stuff because they had built some structures at this time, so they did have shelter. But we're used to refrigerators and freezers and things like that, and they had all this food without all that technology that we're used to and very comfortable with today in the modern world. And they were able to bake these pies and cook the food and everything, and they all ate together. And then they even played games and had fun. And it was really more just about like taking a break from all the work and celebrating and being very grateful to God and, enjoying this friendship. And the most important part was that they even prayed together. They prayed, you know, in honor of God for Thanksgiving, and the Indians prayed with them. The Indians prayed with these foreign people, with their foreign religion and their God, in honor of peace. And some of the Indians I probably had already understood what Christianity was from the earlier people that had come there, but they prayed together, and they, in that moment, prayed to the same God. And it's a truly remarkable story because we don't really hear any of this today. Thanksgiving is very washed over. Um, but that festival, that Thanksgiving for the first one, it actually lasted 3 days. They were having such a good time. The Indians didn't want to leave. They had plenty of food, so they just really enjoyed each other's company for 3 straight days. And that's remarkable. Like there are many people today that complain that they can't even be with their family for one Thanksgiving evening because they're afraid politics might come up or something crazy. Meanwhile, these people were of completely different cultures, completely different backgrounds, foreign to each other. The Pilgrims were in a foreign land, and somehow they were able to endure each other's company for 3 full days. So maybe, people today are a little bit too um, emotional about everything and taking things too personally. Maybe you could just get past all that and realize that Thanksgiving is more about everybody, breaking bread and spending time together and being thankful to God. But what is really sad to see, and like I said earlier in the video, Thanksgiving is probably the, most important holiday that we celebrate in America today. It's the only holiday that was really, truly like ordained by God, by putting all this stuff together, making these people come to this new land, decide to be self-governed, and then eventually lead that into what would become the American way of life. And it's sad to see because today everything's very commercialized, everything's changed, and become so, watered down. They even pass right over Thanksgiving. If you notice, they've been doing Christmas. All the companies and everybody's been promoting Christmas way before Thanksgiving. Early in like the first week in November, they were already talking about Christmas and trying to get people to spend money on gifts and shop and, put up their lights and their decorations. And everybody's passing over Thanksgiving. what we're not realizing is that it's probably, like I said, the most important holiday. It's got so much biblical um, surrounding it and, tied into it. And it actually leads to our country's founding. These are the first people who set America on the course where it would eventually become the country it is today. That day, that holiday is really special to this nation. And I personally believe we shouldn't skip over it. We shouldn't go to Christmas. And, if you notice, all the other holidays, they're so corporatized and everything has been stolen away from the true essence of the holiday. They make Easter about a bunny instead of about Christ's resurrection. They make Christmas about a fake guy Santa Claus giving gifts rather than making it about Christ's birth. And so many things are, perverted and taken away from what their true meaning is. Thanksgiving is just completely skipped over. It is nice to see that the essence of it does still sort of remain today, where people gather together and they eat a meal and they, break bread and talk and spend time with each other and take time away from work and all the craziness of the world to enjoy each other's company. But it would be nice if people remember the roots of it, that it has to do with Christ, Christianity, and the founding of this nation being a nation of people that are self-governed. So, and peace, making unity between people, especially people that are different from you. So that's something that maybe you could take to Thanksgiving this year, where you decide, let me be civil, let me be peaceful, and put our differences aside and just break bread and spend time together and get along for a moment. And this eventually led to the Thanksgiving Proclamation, where in 1676, they declared Thanksgiving a holy day in Charlestown, Massachusetts, so not far from Cape Cod. They declared Thanksgiving a holy day with the first Thanksgiving proclamation. The first words it starts with is the Holy God, so there is so much Christian roots in our nation, and especially surrounding Thanksgiving, that more people should really look into this holiday. It's a very special and sacred holiday. And if you ever get a chance, to read this, maybe even with your family on Thanksgiving, read the Thanksgiving Proclamation, because it really is special. And it's not that many years. It is 1676, and that was 1621 with the Pilgrims, but it's not that many years after that they declared this. So it's cool because that actually continued on to 1676, where they made it an official proclamation. So, yeah, there's a lot of interesting Christian, roots that tie into this holiday. It's a special day. But I want to show you one last thing which ties into this, and it's sort of like biblical prophecy about the Pilgrim's voyage to America, and it kind of ties into that God truly did call these people to come to this nation. So this is the King James Version, like I talked about before, but it's Hebrews 11. Now take a look at this. And, the Bible is interesting where it could actually be applied to more than one thing. So it doesn't necessarily mean it was written for America. It's interesting when you read it, you will actually see some striking similarities between what they wrote in the Bible a very long time before the Pilgrims had taken their journey. But look at Hebrews 11:9. By faith, he sojourned in a land of promise. Now, they believed that America, a lot of people believed this at that time, especially even Christopher Columbus, that America would become the promised land. It would become a new nation specifically designed for Christians by God. It says, as in a strange country. Well, America was a strange country because they had not been there. They were from, Europe, and they migrated to this new land that was strange to them. Dwellings in tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. So it was the promise of Isaac and Jacob that was delivered from God to their heirs. And their heirs would be some of them would be the pilgrims who were given the inheritance, what would become the land of America. He looked for a city with foundations whose builders and maker is God. So that's another interesting point, because these people believe that God was their sole purpose and their sole reason of going to America, and that he would provide for them. He would give them everything they needed to build. And then sure enough, they were struggling, but then the Indians helped them build their colony, and that was all because they prayed to God and they had continued to have faith. Now take a look at 13. 13 is really interesting. These all died in faith, not having received the promise, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them and embraced them and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. It actually says pilgrims in the Bible. Don't get me wrong, that word existed before the pilgrims used it, but they used it to describe themselves as people that were leaving one location and going on a journey to a new location that was, completely not understood by them. They would have to just kind of figure it out and start new, pioneer this new venture. But it says it right there in 13. They were strangers. They were strangers to that land, but they were pilgrims too. It specifically says strangers and pilgrims. It could have just said strangers, but they were pilgrims. And that's exactly what they considered themselves. And then it says, for they for they that say such things declare plainly that they seek a country. That's exactly what the pilgrims were doing. They were seeking a new country. They wanted to not only have, a place to go to live, the goal was to build a colony and a whole new community and lifestyle that was self-governed. Well, if you're self-governed, you're a country, right? Because you're governed. So they were seeking a new country, but a country where they would be self-governed. And 16 says, but now they desire a better country, that is a heavenly. Wherefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. So that's what's so cool, because that is the reason that they left their country in the first place. They were told they couldn't practice their religion the way they wanted to. They left specifically with the main goal was religious freedom, to be able to practice God, believe in God and practice their faith and Christianity the way they wanted to, not the way that the government told them to. And it's part of the reason why they decided to be self-governed. So they left to go to this new land, which it talks about here, and then it specifically says a place where they're not afraid to call, their God, and he prepared this place for them. That's so specific to the pilgrim's journey of being called by God and going to this nation and declaring this place a land for Christians, and then sharing and spreading that message of the gospel with the people that were there, the natives. And then later on, the First Amendment in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights would be religious freedom, the freedom to practice religion the way you want without the government, interfering. So, yeah, this all has roots in our history in America. And a lot of it, I mean, all of it goes back to God. A lot of it is about spreading the message of the gospel to this new land, and then becoming a nation that would become the land, the first real true land for Christians to collectively gather from around the world and have a place to call home that was designated for them, or for them to also be self-governed, where no one else would be able to tell them what to do, how to live. That's why it even talks about in the Constitution, your rights are your rights granted to you by God and not by government. They're not laws that are passed for us to have the ability to do certain things. They're rights that are given to us by God, and they're written in a way where it says the government can't take these rights from you. It's not they give you the rights. It's they can't take them from you because they're given to you by God. They're inherent. So, yeah, it's just so interesting. There's a lot of interesting stuff here. There's a lot of interesting stuff here with all this, but I just, thought because it's Thanksgiving, I would share with you, that interesting history about Thanksgiving. And, yeah, if you ever wanted to read these documents, the Mayflower Compact, the first Thanksgiving Proclamation, that passage in Hebrews, with, could potentially be interpreted as the prophecy of America and the Pilgrim's Voyage to America. There's just a lot of cool, interesting stuff here that all goes back to God, and America truly is a Christian nation. So, next time you're thinking about the holidays or even today, just remember Thanksgiving is a special day. It's a holy day. That's where we get holiday from. It's a holy day, and it has Christian roots, and it really is an important day that should be celebrated in honor of God and peace amongst those that we celebrate it with. So enjoy the day, enjoy the food, happy Thanksgiving, and that's it for this video. Stay tuned for the next one. All right, everybody, I just want to take a moment to promote my children's book. This is Little Boy Full of Love. That's me on the back. And this is a little sneak peek on the inside. It's a great book. It's a children's book. I actually wrote this for my son, and it's available right now on Amazon, Walmart, Barnes & Noble, Indigo, Bookshop.org, and a lot of other online platforms. But more importantly to me, it's actually available in a lot of bookstores throughout the country. You can find out which ones are closest to you on my Instagram page. You know, we highly recommend that you shop local, buy from a local bookstore. So if you are looking to, you know, get a children's book for you or anybody you know, or even with the holidays coming up, it's a great time to, you know, buy a children's book as a gift. You know, definitely get it from a bookstore that's local to you. But if you absolutely can't get it from one of the bookstores that are currently carrying it right now, and we're in about 15 or 16 different states across the country, so it may actually be in your state, and it could even be local to you. But if you can't get it from the physical bookstore, check out our Amazon storefront. The book's available on there right now. And like I said, with the holidays coming up, you may want to do your Christmas or Hanukkah or holiday shopping early, and you can even order it from our Amazon storefront and ship it directly to whoever you're gifting it to. But it's available on those platforms, Amazon storefront and bookstores and other websites that I mentioned. But I want to take a moment here to look at the storefront just to give you an idea of some other stuff that we have available on there. These are products that we highly recommend. They are things that we use in our daily lives, and it's all organized by category. So it's a lot easier to, you know, shop for the holidays and specifically for things that interest you, particular categories. Available right now, many different items on our storefront. If you can see here, 61 items just in women's apparel, fall decor, because right now we're in fall, 26 items, kitchen items, you know, baking specifically, things for around the house, children's toys, even stuff for parties. If you're trying to save money on a party and throwing your own, you know, occasion, you can even buy some cool gadgets here to help you, you know, put on a better party. You know, health and wellness items here, even stuff for Christmas. And there's the book right there. So you can get it from the storefront. You can get it from the bookstores, like I mentioned. But it's available on all these different platforms. It's really easy to find and gift to somebody. Also, I want to show you the apparel shop, and these are some clothing items that we actually produced. So if you're looking to get some cool apparel items, you know, shirts, hoodies, long sleeve, short sleeve, leggings, even accessories, cell phone cases, women's makeup bags, fanny packs, coffee mugs, all different types of stuff, even some, you know, art, all different categories here, apparel, homeware, accessories, drinks, even digital items. It's all on this store, healthybodygoodsoul.com. Anything that pertains to you or somebody that you're looking to get a gift for the holidays. A lot of great designs on here, a lot of cool designs that we actually custom created. Stainless steel water bottles, especially now with the fall and winter. A lot of cool hoodies and long sleeve shirts. This is a really cool one, I think, for women. The original Be Your Soul apparel, that one's actually really popular. People tend to like that. This one's one of my favorites. The free shirt. It's the American flag, and it says free, and that says not property of the United States government. That one's pretty cool. Got all different types of tank tops, hoodies, long sleeve, short sleeve, tote bags, coffee mugs, even some items for kids, backpacks. So if you're the type that likes to, you know, plan ahead, I would definitely recommend ordering from the Amazon storefront or the apparel shop within the next couple of weeks to get everything in time for the holidays. Use code SAVE15 on the apparel shop to save 15% off everything on the storefront. So order within the next week or two, and you'll definitely have everything in time for the holidays. Definitely check out all the links to everything, the Amazon storefront, the book, and the apparel shop in my bio on all my platforms: Rumble, YouTube, Instagram, Spotify. But you can also find them in all the show notes for every episode that I post, and get all your orders in time for the holidays. All right, that's it for this video. Don't forget to like, follow, subscribe, share, all that good stuff. It helps the channel continue to grow. And put in the comments things that you would like me to talk about and make videos on for the future, and I will definitely do my best to do that. Stay tuned for the next one.